Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this session on women and the workforce, getting down to business, women, work, and the global economy. I'm joined here on stage by Winnie Byanyima. She's the International Executive Director of Oxfam. Next to her is Sahar Nasr. She's the Minister of International Cooperation for Egypt. Then there's David Lipton, the IMF's first Deputy Managing Director. Next to David is Tyson. She's come over from the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. And at the end, we have Lant Pritchett. He's a senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. What we're going to spend the next hour or so discussing, and we'll be very happy to take questions from all of you. So towards the end of the panel, I'll ask you for your questions and thoughts as well. We're going to look at women in the labor force, female participation, how far we've got to, what does the landscape look like at the moment, and what are the hurdles to getting more women into the labor force at all levels, particularly at the beginning focusing on women in senior levels, because that seems to be where we've stalled in many of the developed economies anyway. What are the hurdles? How can we overcome that? And that it's not just in the corporate sector, but looking more broadly at women in politics, women in civil society as well. So we will cover the whole gamut of issues surrounding women in the workforce and the benefits that accrue if we can get more women into senior positions, and the research that the IMF has done on that. So let me start with you, David Lipton, as the representative of the IMF here. Why is the IMF doing a panel on women in the workforce?
Let me start by welcoming everyone. I'm very glad you're here for this topic. We think this is a very important topic. Of course, one can come at this subject from so many different angles. First, as a moral or a human rights issue, or as what you might call a micro issue. A woman who has economic opportunities will be able to provide for her family. But it struck us that it's also a macroeconomic issue. And we set out to explore how important it was and found that, looking at it empirically, we think it really is a game-changing macroeconomic issue, that if women have economic opportunity, that the effects on GDP could be very substantial, that making the argument from the vantage point of economics may allow some leverage or some traction with those who aren't swayed by moral or human rights arguments, but who might look at it from their own self-interest of wanting to have a more vibrant economy. So we've done a lot of research, and the research really looks at what kinds of barriers there are to women having economic activity, having economic opportunity, what kinds of public policies restrain them and affect them. We find that the effects are across the entire spectrum of women's potential interactions in the economy, starting with the need for girls' education, the need for women to have child care so that they can enter the labor force, the ability to participate, but then to progress through up the ladder of success, whether it's in some very simple enterprise or in corporations. Moreover, it seems to be important in all kinds of countries, from very poor developing countries to advanced economies. And the potential, as I say, quantitatively is very large. The need to, there are many needs to bring about these benefits, and I hope this panel will give all of you some insight into how that can come about. But I think this research I find very persuasive. I hope you will too, and I think it comes at a moment where the world really needs all the help that it can get from the standpoint of the macroeconomy, and creating economic opportunity for women across the world, across the spectrum of needs, is both an important, from a moral standpoint, an important undertaking, but also one that could be, as I said, very game-changing for the global economy.
the IMF has just produced a study on Europe showing that when you have more women in senior positions, it seems that those companies are performing better. Sahar, I must have sat in countless boardrooms in the United States and explained to countless, mostly men on executive committees, that there are now, I think, more than half a dozen global studies that show if you can get companies with more women in senior positions and making more money, that by every measure of profitability, they are doing better. Now, those studies are not showing causality, but they are showing a correlation. You worked for years on gender issues before you became minister, and we'll talk about Egypt in a minute, but you worked on years for gender issues at the World Bank. Do you think that that argument is now widely recognized?
I think the argument is not widely recognized. I think we need to disseminate that information more widely. And I think we need to add to it another dimension, because I come from a developing economy, and it's very important to also highlight that having small and medium enterprises that are owned by women access to finance and ensuring that they have a level playing field is very critical. And these firms are the ones that tend to create jobs for more women, and hence it's not just a corporate issue, and it's not just better performance of companies, but I'm also thinking of the smaller firms that needs to be empowered and needs to grow further and needs to employ women. And in fact, it's very interesting that the default, that there is a perception that enterprises that are owned by women are higher risk, and that's not, empirical evidence shows that it's not true at all.
It's actually the opposite.
It's exactly the opposite. In fact, the default rate among women is much lower, and they're more concerned about their performance, and they need to go often an extra mile to prove that they can do a same job, or in many cases, a better job.
Okay, Laura, you're an economist. I thought people were meant to be persuaded by economic data. There is now so much data out there showing that we need more women in senior positions and across the board, and that women are good for business, whether it's in small businesses in Egypt or in corporate boardrooms in New York. Why have we, what's happening? Why is this data not being taken seriously, listened to?
Well, I want to say that I think, first of all, it is important that we have to keep making the studies available. We have to keep getting them out there. The evidence has mounted. The IMF has played an important role on that. Actually, everybody on this panel has played a role in, I come to this from the World Economic Forum, and we started a gender parity report 10 years ago. The data shows that there are substantial gender inequalities across countries at all development levels, that we've pretty much stalled in terms of making progress on these gender gaps. So the evidence is out there. It has led some companies and some business leaders and some business associations and some governments, even some local governments, even some municipal governments, to try to figure out how to do things to bring down or increase women's economic opportunity, is basically how I'll put it. You could say bring down gender disparities, but let's say increase women's economic opportunities. It's just a very slow process, and frankly, it's too slow. By the World Economic Forum measures, we did a little calculation last year that how long would it take at the current rate of progress on indicators of economic performance to eliminate the gender gap in the economy? 85 years. Okay, well, this isn't happening. This is not something we're going to allow to happen. So we now are really, I think, have to make sure we continue to do the work of producing the information and getting it out there, but we also use it to try to mobilize actors to take action. And I know, for example, that a number of people on the panel are doing that, including the IMF itself, which, as we focus on the macro relevant effects of gender disparity, those can then be discussed with member governments in terms of tax policy, in terms of expenditure policy. What should you be making your investments in? What about investment in childcare compared to investment in infrastructure? Maybe investment in childcare is something which creates a social infrastructure, a talented future workforce, and also mobilizes more of the existing workforce because you're helping them balance work and child rearing, maybe that investment has a huge payoff, which we're not measuring relative to something we can more easily measure, rate of return on infrastructure. So I want to start with the view that I'm delighted that there's so much more attention to this by economists. There's so much more attention to this by international organizations. Gender has become mainstreamed as an issue at the IMF and at the World Bank. Those are really important developments. Nonetheless, progress is much too slow. And so part of what these kinds of discussions are meant to do is to get out the information and to mobilize people in their own area of life. So to go just to the issue of women on boards for a minute, I do know now that whether influenced directly by a quota in some countries or by the threat of a quota in other countries or just by pure transparency, you show up in a set of articles as having no women on the board, that becomes an issue then for the governance committee and the comm committee and the board itself to say, you know, this is not a good place to be. We're suffering from the point of view of our reputation, our links to customers, our links to employees who are women who want to see some board members on the board. So I think there's more going on. I think there's a lot of activity. I would still say the pace is too slow. So how about if I start there? Half full, half empty, maybe quarter full, 3/4 empty?
Yeah, I sometimes feel like I'm banging my head against a wall and then I feel the next day optimistic. So I think I'm in the same half full, half empty glass. I have had, and I'm talking, the work I have done has mostly been looking at Western industrialized countries, and I have recently found that I've had senior bankers and senior lawyers come to me and say to me, you know what, we want to address gender issues in our corporation, in our firm, because increasingly our clients are women. And that is changing things too. So we can't, and our clients don't want to walk into a room full of a whole load of white guys and be told how to invest their money or told what to do with their lawsuits. So maybe that in America might change things as well. Winnie, we've been touching particularly on and the IMF has done this new research in Europe, and it's looking particularly in women at senior levels and management levels in corporations. Is there a divide in the pace of progress between developed countries and developing countries?
Well, we welcome the research that the IMF has done, and I praise Christine Lagarde for bringing these issues into the IMF. But let's be clear, these are just the baby steps. And let's also understand that, let's step back, because we are dealing with a rigged economy. We have a situation where the economy as it's structured now is biased, fundamentally biased against women. It is structured in a way where the benefits of growth are disproportionately accruing to the people at the top, mostly men, and leaving women and girls at the bottom and behind.
Are you talking particularly about the developing countries that Oxfam deals with, or are you talking globally?
I'm talking about the global economy, because we are now in a globalized economy. And there are linkages between developing countries and the rich countries. The economies now are not creating decent jobs with living wages for all people. We have growth, but growth that isn't giving people the decent wages. And we have many examples across Asia and Africa, where people have jobs, but these jobs are just a trap in poverty. And these are mainly for women. It's women working in the informal sector. 75% of women working in Asia and Africa in the informal sector with jobs that don't give them benefits, no sick pay, no leave, no maternity leave, no pensions. That's the kind of work that they do.
75% of people working in the informal sector in Asia and Africa
of women's work, of women in Asia and Africa are working in the informal sector. So the majority are out there doing this kind of work that's precarious, that doesn't have benefits, that's low paid. So, but further, this economy doesn't count all the work that women do and therefore doesn't reward it. That's fundamental in the structure of the economy and needs to be changed. So if we want to really make women equal in the economy, we must think about restructuring the economic model. Just trying to fit them in an economy that's rigged against them will have some benefits here and there, but will not ultimately give equality to women in the economy. Let me give you a story, a nice one I like to use. Paul Samuelson, the famous economist, the Nobel laureate, told this story about a professor. You know the story. The professor who is a bachelor, who has his maid who comes in, cooks, cleans, mends his clothes. He falls in love with her. He marries her. And she continues to cook, clean, and mend his clothes, living with him. Everything remains the same in the economy. The GDP falls. Yes, this is the point. That a lot of the work that women do, both as care work, caring for communities, caring for families, plus the unpaid work that women do on family farms, they are labor, but they are not paid a wage. All this is not counted and therefore not rewarded through policies. And that is what locks women out of these figures that you mentioned of women's labor force participation.
The story I heard recently was from a sociologist who said to me that white men have been the greatest recipients of the best ever affirmative action program in the history of the world.
I couldn't agree more.
The history of the world.
I could not agree with that more, because women are really a subsidy on the economy, on the paid economy.
Lant, let me pick a rigged economy that is due for a total overhaul, that as it is will never allow for the kind of progress that Laura was talking about wanting to see, where we can get more women into full participation in the labor force.
I'm sorry, what?
A rigged economy.
Is it a rigged economy?
Wow. Certainly, I think many economies are rigged, and I think one of the strange coincidences is that freer economies tend to be freer economies. One of the arguments economists have always made is more competition is typically good for excluded minorities, because the more competition there is, the more you actually have to seek out the best, and the less attention you can pay to allocating favors to your cronies in terms of rents. So in some sense, truly competitive economies that don't keep people, for instance, marginalized in the informal sector, but having a truly competitive formal sector rather than a division between a restricted formal sector and an informal sector is actually good typically for progress. I think one of the things, I like the title of this sort of overall session of Getting Down to Business, because I worry that often women's issues get ghettoized as coincident with poverty issues. Oh, we need to talk about women and poverty.
I agree.
And then one looks exclusively at ways in which, given women's exclusion from the modern economy and from the productive sector, how we can make their lives marginally better, rather than by asking how do we actually make women enormously more productive by connecting them effectively with the productive sector. So my colleague Ricardo Hausman at Harvard has done a study about connectivity and how actually inclusion means getting people into the most productive places. So issues like transport infrastructure actually also play a role in gender, because if you can't move from where you are effectively to where your productivity might be highest, which might be in an urban center, might be at a factory, and back again quickly and cheaply, then you stay in some sense excluded from the highly productive sector. So I think inclusion actually should think about how do we unleash the productivity by including people into an already productive economy.
So Sahar, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of Egypt and women's inclusion into the workforce, do you still think that gender in business is seen, as Lant was suggesting, as a separate poverty issue as opposed to being seen as an integral part of potential GDP growth?
I think it's important to highlight that, in fact, in Egypt, it's not gender and women's mainstreaming is not just a social justice issue at all, or a poverty issue. In fact, the government's program that has just been discussed at the parliament looks very carefully and promotes a sustainable development path, and that includes women. The government has invested, and private sector has invested in girls' education and healthcare services, and hence they have to be productive agents in society. And you see that their participation and the indicators we're trying to achieve is increasing their participation in the labor market. But I think it is also very important to ensure that you have the adequate infrastructure that helps women balance and be able to play their role at a family level, but also to be a productive agent in society, ensuring that there is child care services is important, but also infrastructure. For example, in Egypt, one of the challenges there, if you don't have the right public transportation infrastructure that would allow women to commute, especially if you're talking about poorer areas, then that hinders them.
But that's true for men too. I mean, men need that kind of commuting infrastructure as well, right?
It is a bit different for men, because if it's late night, it becomes more challenging and higher risk for women to commute. Mothers often have to be around when kids return to school. It's not the same, so timeliness matters more for women. That's what the survey that was conducted jointly by the World Bank Group and IFC, that shows that it hinders. It's more of a women's issue than men's issue. Transportation, childcare services, that's very important to ensure that they play an active role in the labor market.
Laura, will we get to a stage where childcare services are no longer just seen as a women's issue, but as a family issue?
So they absolutely, we must move in that direction. And I think that one of the really important things going on right now in this whole area is there's an increasing attention to the issue of care. There's an increasing attention in many ways. One is, just as Winnie said, we have a very significant part of economic life, of the structure of our economies, which is completely unmeasured. So the latest, it's possibly, the McKinsey estimate was $1 trillion of lost unreported GDP. In the US, the last estimate I saw is our GDP would be 25% higher if we actually included the care that is going on, largely disproportionately carried out by women, because all of the time surveys suggest, the most recent time survey of this among the developed countries showed clearly that women spend twice as much time on unpaid care as men, and basically 3/4 of the time that men spend in paid
I imagine
work.
in developing countries that number's even higher, right?
And basically this is care that is not counted, and that actually, regardless of what level of development, it seems to me, what level of development, this is a key issue to how you unlock economic opportunity for women. Whether it is in the provision of care services itself, if we valued these services and paid for these services and protected these services and had public support for these services, those would be a lot of good jobs, of decent jobs. Not there. But also for women who are trying to struggle to get home from the transportation or decide simply, we know around the world, labor force participation rates for women are affected by the availability and accessibility of childcare. If you have to, you look at the wage you can get in your employment, whether it's formal, informal, high level, low level, and you look at the cost of the childcare you would have to make up if you left the home, for lots of women, it's like, my employment opportunity is to stay home. So this is a fundamental issue, it seems to me, and it is an issue now which I think has garnered a lot of attention among the international organizations, the business organizations, and the governments that are trying to do something. So one of the things that, one of the arrows in the Abenomics sort of set of arrows was mobilizing female labor force participation, because it's a huge problem of demographics in Japan. They've made some progress on this, and one of the main ways they're going after this is to try to figure out how to help families, but it's mainly women because that's how the services are provided, deal with having more public support for child care, more paid paternity and maternity leave, things that companies can do as well as governments can do. So I just think this is a fundamental issue, getting more attention, and if we're going to make better progress in the 85-year trajectory, this is essential. It's absolutely essential.
David, Prime Minister Abe has made it a kind of key part of his economic program to bring more women into the labor force. Having lived and worked in Japan for 3 years, I can see the cultural hurdles that he's up against without even thinking about it. To what extent, if the policy recommendations, and one of them, we've spoken a bit about infrastructure and childcare, and we'll talk about that some more, but one of the interesting things I thought that came out of your recent Europe report was the need for better tax policies, which is not something perhaps most people would think would affect the number of women in the labor force. To what extent is it widely recognized that policies like tax, for example, need to be addressed if we're going to see more women in the workforce?
I mean, speaking generally, not about just about Japan, but Winnie said earlier the system's rigged. In some respects, it's literally rigged in the sense that laws, and that's very generally speaking, including tax laws, can block access to opportunity or can discourage involvement. I mean, there are countries where a woman can't work if her husband doesn't give her permission, in the extreme. But there are all kinds of, I mean, one of the papers that we put out goes through the whole range of public policies, from laws to policies to practices that obstruct access. And, this is overcoming those on a case-by-case basis is the kind of day-in, day-out work that we're moving on to. We have done some case studies, pilot projects with countries, and we've done about 8 of them. We're doing 5 more of them. They span the spectrum of country circumstances, but there are some where the tax policy is a key aspect. There are tax policies that where in essence, the penalty for a second earner in a marriage, in a household, is so high that it discourages participation. But across the budget, whether it's tax policy or spending policy, which gets to some of the points that Lant and Laura were talking about, whether you're providing for not just education, but quality education, whether you're providing for the kind of infrastructure that would facilitate women, whether it's transport or other aspects. There really are a range of, we think that there's a lot governments can do, but to make this happen on a shorter time frame than the 85-year time frame, we think countries really need to roll up their sleeves. They can't do that until they know what the particular obstacles are, and we see it as our job to go in a diagnostic sense and try to identify the obstacles and make some recommendations for changes.
Not even my 10-year-old daughter will be alive in 85 years, so let's hope that it happens before that. Sahar, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I have a comment on taxes. In fact, I want to say that the new tax law that was just ratified in Egypt has actually taken gender into dimension. The previous law did not, only men that had dependent would be subject or have access to tax preferences and tax exemptions, while women, assuming that they're not the house or household takers, they were never exempted whether they had dependent children, and even in cases where women were the sole.
So even if you were the primary breadwinner in your family,
Yes.
if you were a woman, you could not have access to those tax exemptions.
Yes, under the previous law, so at least that's one major milestone that was taken to ensure gender mainstream. Under the previous law, even if you're the only single parent taking care of the kids, you did not have in your form access to fail that you had dependents. Under the new law, that has been streamed under the new tax law, so you would be equal to your peer men. You would have access to tax preferences.
Okay,
so that's a major step.
Do laws like this and infrastructure problems of the kind that you were talking about and that Sahar was talking about and that Winnie touched on as well, do these kinds of situations exist just because the people making the decisions up until recently happen to have been men and haven't kind of thought that, or is it what Winnie was suggesting, that there's an ulterior motive going on here?
But can I complain? Can I also have a chance to say something?
Yes, jump in.
Thank you very much. I have some views on these issues too. On taxation, again, this is evidence of a rigged economy. Because If you look at the developing countries, for many of them, 67%, by the way, of the taxes in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are regressive tax, is a regressive tax, VAT. This kind of taxation places a higher burden of taxation relatively on poor people and less of a burden on higher earning people. And that often is women, because they are the ones paying for the basics of consumption in the poorest families. So they pay a higher burden of taxation. And why do governments depend a lot on regressive taxation? Because those who should be paying the higher taxes have found ways to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. Look at the Panama Papers, what they are telling us. It's a rigged economy. People have found, rich companies have found ways of avoiding legally paying their fair share of taxes, routing their money through tax havens and so many other ways, harmful tax competition, pushing down governments from taxing them. And the result is that governments pass the taxation burden to poor people. Regressive taxation, or they cut social spending, they cut health, they cut education, they cut social protection. And those are the services that then women are forced to substitute with their own labor and to withdraw from the paid economy. So you see that the rigged economy is rigged against women and girls, and that's why I return to the point that we can address it in two ways. One, we can ameliorate the issues by providing a little child care here. It does make a difference. Child care helps women to go to work. Better transportation, it can. But ultimately, unless we recalculate the economy, we have another measure for economic well-being that includes, that recognizes and counts all this work that women do outside paid work, we will not make a lot of progress. It's a recalculation of the economy, and that's why the World Bank and the IMF are important players here. We had a Sarkozy Commission that tried to recalculate this and give us a new way of measuring economic progress. But we need institutions like these IFIs to take it on and give us a new way of measuring economic progress, a new way that counts, that values all this work, all this labor that is up to now uncounted.
Lant, do you agree with that? That the work you are doing on infrastructure and improving the infrastructure broadly that allows female labor force participation will only ever get us so far, as Winnie suggests, that it's not actually going to do the whole job?
No. I think it can get us a long, long way. So I guess maybe I'm a strategic incrementalist, is let's do what we can do. So in answer to your earlier question, I think there are lots of win-win opportunities that are there by inadvertence rather than some deep structural conspiracy. And once the issues get raised, it actually is relatively straightforward to address them. It's not, in fact, that there's some deep issue. Once they get raised and the win-win opportunity gets pointed out, there are opportunities in the world. I think we don't want to go in for, unless we blow up the whole system or some deeply change the way that we do something, we're not going to make progress, because in fact, on a whole variety of issues, we have in fact been making a ton of progress. There's been certain stagnation in some dimensions, but for instance, if you look at, I happened to work in 1992 on a paper, strangely enough, with Larry Summers and Sheryl Sandberg, one of whom was fresh out of Harvard and one of whom was the World Bank's chief economist. And it pointed out that, you know, investing in girls' education, one once included all of the benefits rather than just looking at wages. Once one looked at all the other social benefits in terms of healthier children, in terms of more reductions in fertility, in terms of all the ancillary benefits, that investing in women's education was actually the highest return investment available, whereas before it had almost exclusively been analyzed in terms of impact on wages, and hence women's lack of participation in the labor force, even though they were more productive at providing other things, was discounted in the overall calculation of the benefits. That said, since 1992, and I'm not attributing causation, there's been a revolution in terms of the expansion of girls participating in school. It's just phenomenal how much progress we have made on getting girls into school. Now, there are other issues we need to make progress in that we can come back to. So again, I think a lot of these issues, once you start bringing in the economics, it actually reinforces the availability of win-win opportunities, even within the current structures and system.
So can I,
yes,
I just want to say that, because you mentioned Ricardo, and Ricardo also works on the gender gap report with me, and one of the things that's amazing about, so the report looks at differentials on education and on health, on politics, and on economic empowerment measured as a lot of ways: wage gaps, percentage of women in technical jobs, sort of promotion, various measures. And what you find is that there's been very dramatic progress on closing gender gaps in education. That doesn't mean there aren't some countries and some places which have horrific gender gaps. They have very poor quality education for everyone, and for women it just doesn't even exist. So to say that the world has moved to close its gender gaps in education dramatically is correct. We want to note that there are exceptions to that. The world has also unclosed a lot of its gender gaps in most measures of health. What's stagnated is the closing of gender gaps in the economic area. So that's the one where either the progress is really, really slow. I mean, it's not that it's stagnated, it's just the progress.
What do you mean, Laura, by in the economic area?
So we try to do it in a variety of ways. We call it sort of economic opportunities. There are a bunch of things that go into this measure. There are measures of wage gaps. There are measures of women in technical and scientific education, professional opportunities. There is not, I want to say, and we would only pick this up in terms of wage gaps, and that data is really weak, and I want to admit that. The small and medium-sized enterprise sector, which I think is a really important area for us to know much more about, where the economic opportunities are for women, and is that closing? That's a question I will leave out there. So in the standard measures currently available for 145 countries, what you see is when you put those all together into these indices, you see that, yes, economic progress has continued, but it's been very slow, whereas with education and health, we've seen very dramatic changes. So I just want to support that view, and then say that there's also a lot more to be done. So again, you get to be in the half empty, half full, or yes, we've made a lot of progress, but.
Winnie and then Lant. Go ahead, Winnie.
If we're looking
Sahar, I want
at,
to bring you in.
we began this discussion looking at women's participation in the economy. I think there's, yes, a strong correlation between education, girls' education particularly, and growth, and also education and women's participation in the economy. But let's be careful. The figures in Latin America tell us that's one region where the gap between girls and boys in education has closed. In fact, you now have some reverse gender gaps where there are more girls coming out of school than boys or registering. However, that's a region with quite low female labor force participation. I think it's only the MENA region that's lower than it. Why is that? Why are the benefits of education not translating into economic benefit for women? Because, again, of the structural barriers in the economy. The barriers that women face in the economy start in the household, in the market, in public policy, in public institutions as well. And unless you have a holistic way of addressing all that, women can fail to use education to empower themselves economically. In Latin America, it's a big challenge about balancing care and work. And we see that companies are beginning to wake up to it, and governments are beginning to realize the importance of
the public policies that can address this. We mentioned the child care, the public transportation, most importantly the child care, but the private sector policies are key here. And seeing companies now beginning to compete in terms of workplace policies that reward women and allow women to juggle the roles and give men the opportunity to care for children too and be parents. These policies are now, I think that's what's hopeful, that we're seeing the private sector also having a bit of a race to the top in terms of...
Mind you, here in the United States, women get more degrees, more postgraduate degrees, more PhDs than men do, and the pay gap is large and is still not closing even at the more senior levels. So, it's not necessarily translating to...
The pay gap measures usually used, you have to sort of disaggregate a little here. There certainly is a remaining pay gap once you correct for. So basically the way economists would go about it is say, okay, there's a pay gap due to educational differentials, that's closed, maybe. Maybe not, because for example, the pay gap in STEM may not have closed because women are not so involved in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. So basically they're getting degrees, but they're getting degrees in the law, and the law pay differentials going down, or they're getting degrees in medicine and that's going down, but not in STEM. So one thing is there's education. Then there's sectoral choices. What industries do women and men go into? Because there's pretty big pay differentials by sector. So then you have to begin to think about why are there so few women? What are the barriers to women in a place like tech or mining and certain parts of manufacturing and not in retail, okay? Because that's, and then the last thing would be occupational, and there I think you have the issue of, do women face, and I think there's a lot of evidence that they do face, barriers to advancement. So you may come in a firm exactly parity with your male colleague based on your education. There's more and more evidence that that is happening in the US and probably in the other developed countries, So you come in at parity, and 10 years later, 5 years later, there's lack of parity. What's going on? You very quickly get to care here. You very quickly get to women leaving the labor force for a while, coming back, taking part-time jobs because they have family responsibilities. The expectations of
probably
young...
at 10 years, maybe not at 5 years out of college.
So I'm saying in that period of time, the 5 to 10 year period, and then going forward, because the evidence suggests that if you get into a pay disparity in that 5 to 10 year period when you move out of your position for a while, that is very hard to overcome over a lifetime of work, okay? It's very hard to overcome. So I just want to say it's maybe because today I really have focused on this whole issue of the whole pathway. So you start with education as a way to get women in the channel. And clearly, I completely agree with Winnie, a lot of the discussion here, we have to be very careful of differences in development level, because getting in the pathway to be in a formal enterprise that's a global company is a lot different than how do you, as an informal or a small enterprise, a women-owned enterprise, sell into the global supply chain. Those are two really important issues, but they're different issues. So I just want to say, when we look at the pay differentials across countries, we have to understand all of the factors that play into that, and then all of the ways that either policy or a business or a household, by rearranging its family work, could affect that pay differential over time. There are multidimensional causes of the pay differential, and probably at the end of the day, this is the most recent study in the US would say, at the end of the day, there's about a 10% differential we can't explain by anything. Okay, so I just, pay is so complicated an area, and by the way, this is where the data, maybe David will tell me this isn't true, the data is really not good here. It's really not good. So if you're trying to do any cross-international comparisons, you're working with data that is...
And it's an area where there are a lot of personal choices that are hard to get at in data anyway.
And there are a lot of personal choices, or structural choices. I'll use
choices,
Winnie's term here, they're structural
issues
choices.
surrounding office culture and what is seen as socially acceptable or not. Wait, one second, Winnie. I want to get Sahar in. Yes.
All that stuff. I think that data has shown that there has been some pay disparities, and not necessarily correlated with taking leave or being away or trying to balance the family. I think there is some gender inequalities just by being a woman in many cases. There's glass ceilings too. So not only that there are sectors that women find it tough to work in when it's late hours, and of course we need to take into account that there is norms and cultures. Yeah, there's norms and cultures that differ from one region to the other. We need to take that into account, and there's glass ceilings. So you're very right that sometimes women and girls perform better in schools than universities, and then when it comes to the job, then it's more challenging for her to achieve, despite that she could be, in many cases, have the same potential, but not necessarily equal opportunity. It's only on large corporates. I worked before at the World Bank or the IMF, where there is clear guidelines on gender mainstreaming. So people with high posts, if they don't mainstream by gender or different nationalities, then it becomes tougher for them to get further promotion. But if you're talking about smaller firms and medium, it becomes much more challenging where there is no institutional framework that puts clear guidance on that. I just want to respond to an earlier question that you raised that I think is very important. Is it because women are not in the decision-making process, so many things such as tax law and glass ceilings and opportunities is not? I think that's very true. We need to be represented in the decision-making process. I think that makes a difference, not because you will be there to represent women's issues at all, but I think it's also ensuring diversification and gender mainstreaming. You're there on the table making decisions.
Well, talk to us as a minister from Egypt. How many women does it take sitting in the room to change a policy, to get it to be a policy that is actually more effective for improving women's participation in the labor force?
In the current cabinet, we're 4, which is an improvement. We were 3 two weeks back.
Out of how many?
Out of 30, I think 30 ministers. But let me tell you, like, we're 4 influential women in the cabinet, and we're managing an important portfolios. So I'm international cooperation. My other colleague is working on investments, which is dealing with all the private sector issues, and another colleague on social solidarity, and the third is on migrants. And so it's important also what we represent at the cabinet. But more important, which was something that I'm very proud of and impressed, that the new parliament that is now in place, we have 15% representation of women, of which 50% of these women are youth under the age of 35. That's major, because they will be the ones reviewing the laws, they will be looking at the budget, they're now reviewing the government's program. So I think it matters to have women there represented in the decision-making process.
David, when you, on this issue, when you produce a report like the one that you've just produced on Europe, and the IMF has done several of them, what is the most effective thing for getting the findings of that report translated into policy changes? What works?
Well, I think we have to be modest and say that we're still exploring that. I mean, we've done the research, the people who did the work. I'm not the expert. They're sitting here in the front row. I wanted to come back and say I think that I think our strategy is first, let me say, it would be great if we had better data. I think we should be thinking about the contributions women make that aren't counted. Lant study shows that economists can count that, and in counting it, come up with findings that really are contrary to the way people think about a subject, and that can matter, and we should do more of it. I agree with that. But I think our point is, in this first cut, to make the case so convincingly that even with the present metrics, it makes sense to have more opportunity for women all the way through the spectrum, from, as children getting education, as young mothers having opportunities. I think we're going to show that it's so clearly important that action should be taken. Now, that may mean and I don't know how many women it takes in an organization to make a difference. We happen to have an organization that's run by a woman. That makes a difference.
Catalyst's suggestion is that 3 women on the board makes this.
Right. We don't have 3 women on our executive board. And that's an issue that Christine Lagarde raises with our membership all of the time.
You have 1 out of 20.
We have one right now.
On the board.
And then there are several alternate directors. But surely we can do better there. We have diversity goals in staff for hiring and for advancement. We're working on it. We're making progress. It's by no means enough progress. My point is that it makes sense to push the envelope and to make change. I remember I was at the IMF when I first came out of graduate school, and in my first few years I spent a lot of time in Latin America, where there is, exactly as Winnie says, a lot of suppression of the progress of women in the labor force. And it occurred to me, because my counterparts a couple of times were women, they were the only women in the central bank. They were always the best. And it occurred to me that they were the best at their job because they'd been held back from what they probably deserved to be doing, promoted far more. You know, I think I hope that we make a case, a general case, and then in our work with individual countries, we make a convincing case to countries to make changes. There are now an increasing range of policy changes. There are countries in Europe where a good fraction of the parliament is women, where a good fraction of cabinet ministers are women. In the new Canadian government, I believe 50% of the cabinet is women. We will see whether diversity matters. I think we'll find huge effects, but we'll have to see and then, you know, learn in individual cases and with studies what we can urge others to attempt to do.
Winnie, what do you find works when you speak to governments?
But let me first give you some figures. We now have about 23% women in parliaments globally. We tend to count these numbers. Women in decision making, we use that figure, 23%. In 1995, when there was a 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, this figure was 19%. So in 21 years, we pushed it up by just 4%. That's progress. I don't think so. That's just too slow. We have 32% women in businesses, women in senior leadership positions in business. 32%. No, sorry, 22%. And in 32% of businesses, there are no female leaders at all. That's where we are. So I'm impatient for progress. In some countries, it's even worse. In Japan, it's only 8% of women in senior positions of business. So I think we need to move it faster. We can't keep moving at that snail's pace and saying we are making progress. And quotas are known to work. Quotas work. Europe is trying quotas on boards in business. Quotas in politics have worked very well in Europe, in Africa, but are still resisted in Latin America, but are still resisted in some countries and regions. But let's be clear. Today, there are at least 155 countries who have at least one law that restricts women's economic empowerment, that puts a barrier, a legal barrier to women in the economy. 155 countries. And there are still 18 countries where a man can still stop his wife from going to work. 18 countries. So we're talking of barriers that can be removed by the stroke of a pen, the parliament making a reform, no cost, but they are still there. We're talking of norms, social norms, that make women minors, remove them from the category of adults that exists today, that can be changed by a lot of social mobilization. But governments leave that job to NGOs like us. They don't think it's their job to change social attitudes and social behavior. And then you have real economic policies that are not being shaped by women because they are not sitting there thank you. I mean, you are 4 women in a cabinet of, but I think the research shows that you need a critical mass to get really policy change in parliaments and cabinets, and we still don't have it.
Right.
So, but these things can happen, but they don't happen because we lack the political will. The evidence is there, and the bank and the IMF are putting the evidence on the table now, which is good.
Well, and countless other organizations. I think the first study on some of this was in 1996. Pepperdine did a study on, you know, the correlation between getting more women into higher positions and getting more results. 96 was the first one. It's been a while that this information has been out there. Okay, let's go to the audience. There are microphones that we can hand around. And if you, thank you, we've got the lights up so I can actually see you.
So
Do we have any questions? Yes. Wait a second for the microphone. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Thierry Dongala with the Africa Investment Leaders Forum. I hear, I'm really glad to hear that we're impatient for progress. I was wondering, have either of you seen any money following a lot of the speech that has been made on this topic? I know that, for example, on Wall Street, there's a lot of products that are being developed, like green bonds, you know, pretty much showing that you can increase profit by also being, you know, environmentally sustainable. Is there a way that you can show that, you know, businesses can be better when they hit that 50% mark, and we can put our money behind it? We could buy a stock, we could buy a bond that's promoting this.
I think there are actually some funds that are doing exactly that are
But
looking at
first,
the number of women on board. But go ahead, David.
the recent study that the IMF's done on Europe looks at the question of whether women on boards affects profitability and performance of companies, and it finds a positive effect. So now,
does it show causality, that it's because the women are on the board?
It controls for as much as they've been able to control for, and I think it's a pretty sound. That is a pretty sound conclusion. I think it's hard to know some of the answers to some of the questions that came up before about whether there are critical masses beyond which performance really improves even more. But I think it's an important result, and it's a result that I think that the study also shows is true with respect to women up and down the corporate spectrum, not just in the board situation.
Can I also say, I think I haven't, I've just learned about the study, but I've seen a number of other studies, and there are a lot of strong studies and a lot of good evidence. There was a report just a few years ago that Credit Suisse Research Institute put out. It's on their website. They went around the world, 3,000 companies, these are global companies operating in all regions throughout the world in all sectors. And they were able to establish a strong relationship between diversity in top management positions and diversity on boards and various measures of profitability. There are now funds, you're absolutely right, that do allow investors to actually look at these gender measures as an indicator of economic performance, even concentrate their holdings in companies that meet certain gendered diversity targets. So investors can do that. There's a there's something called the Sustainable Accounting Standards Body in the United States, and there are similar bodies in Europe now that are looking at a whole bunch of indicators of what you would call environmental, social, and governance effectiveness, and gender disparity on boards and management is one of those measures of effectiveness. And then they're creating standards of materiality, that is, when do these things really affect a company's performance? What should investors know about this? How can they compare across companies? So I think there's going to be more and more of this as the evidence continues to develop, and I think there are already some opportunities out there now. I think the IMF study will help in this regard.
Any more questions? Yes, in the middle here in the front. The lady in the white jacket in the front, thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for this really interesting panel today. My name is Rachel Fredman. I work with the U.S. Treasury Department. And something I think that I would like to hear these panelists talk about a little bit is the gender gap in access to financial services. So according to the World Bank's Global Findex data, there's been an 11 percentage point increase during the past 5 years of both genders' access to financial services, but women still lag behind men. 7 percentage points globally and as much as 11% in developing countries. So I think that there's very clear policy solutions for that, and there's also definitely a role of the private sector. I'd love to hear your views on this issue.
Winnie, do you want to jump in on that, and then Sahar?
Yes, this is critical, particularly for women in the South, because in the South, still the biggest sector that's employing women is agriculture. And there, the inability of women to access finance, to control assets, are huge barriers to their empowerment. And access to finance is very much associated with also control of assets. So the two go together. And we're seeing more products being made, more efforts at both public, by governments and the private sector to increase women's access to finance. Again, it's always that women are bankable. They pay back, so give them money. Yeah, I like the argument, but it seems to me that every time opportunity for women is measured against their ability to deliver, and a higher standard is expected of them than of men. So in a way, it's discriminating. Can women deliver to be in the parliament? Do women bring results? Do they make a difference when they come to the parliament? For heaven's sake, they should be there because they have a right to be there. And I don't say that capital should be made available just because they are women, but I think it should be on the same terms as men. They should have equal access to capital, but very often the measure is always higher for them. Do they return 99% or? Yeah, but it's an area that needs.
The IFC recently did a report on insurance and women, and that was interesting too, looking at how the insurance industry has suddenly woken up to the fact that they weren't making products that were attractive to women, and so they're starting to change that too. Sahar, you wanted to jump in.
Indeed, I think access to finance is a major challenge, and I think it's across the board, but obviously the disparities is much larger among women for several reasons. First, there is a perception by the financial institution that it's higher risk, which is not proved by any evidence or numbers in terms of NPLs. Second, in terms of ownership of assets, that's a challenge in major developing countries where women, even if they inherit certain assets, they don't have the full authority to use them as their collaterals. And third, women are in general more present in the microfinance sector, and that's an area where a lot of donors, in fact, USAID is providing a lot of support, but also the World Bank and IFC are providing a lot of support on that, and through several instruments that I think we need to promote, because beyond the research that the IMF has put forward, I think it's important that the programs put by the IMF and the World Bank promote gender mainstreaming in terms of access to ensure and enhance their economic empowerment through the issuance. For example, in Egypt, the IFC and the bank helped the government issue for the first time a microfinance law, which is especially catering women in rural areas. And also the mortgage finance, so you mentioned insurance, but also access to shelter and access to home. Now also the law ensures that women would have equal access, especially in the past they would contribute to owning a house, but they would not necessarily register the house under their name. So now it's allowing for mutual ownership of a home. So I think it's very true, access to finance is a priority, but we need to look at the macro story, because if you have a budget deficit, there's a bit of crowding out, and hence access to finance has been a major challenge, especially for smaller firms and especially for women. Very true.
There's a lady here with a question.
Hi, I'm Salma Nims. I'm the Secretary General of the Jordanian National Commission for Women. I think one of the issues that have not come up here, and probably it's because we're under the IMF and we're discussing economic policy, is social attitudes, which started coming out now. I don't think that gender roles have been revisited in the past 50 years. So as long as we see women as still the only carers within the home, as long as we see their income as secondary to the household, then the whole approach of economy and the private sector and all the policies sees them as not important and core to the economy itself, and then we don't have to really reconsider how their contribution to the household and the economy is affected. So as long as this is happening, and I think at this time in history, in a region like the MENA region, we really need to look at how radicalization is affecting the role of women within the society and how it is perceived. For 50 years, we've been working on increasing the role of women in the economy. However, now we're faced with a trans-border thinking that puts women again as items that are going to be used. And this is affecting the thinking of the youth. And this is really going to regress whatever progress we've achieved. So I think that if we keep thinking like that, if we keep thinking that, as you said, daycare is for women, it's supposed to let women go to work, and transport is, we're not going to change anything. And this is, and the problem is that lots of women in the Arab world, their salaries, they're unable to control their salaries. They take their salaries and the ATM card is with the husband. So actually there is no feasibility for her to work. She's ending up being a slave, not actually contributing to the... So we really, I think the social attitudes needs to be revisited. We cannot ignore them, although it's very important to look at the legislations and the policies, but in regions like our region, there's still a lot to be done when it comes to social attitudes.
Lant, let me just, I was going to ask you this. To what extent does changing the kinds of infrastructure and education and improving access to education and the kinds of things that you are doing work on help change the social attitudes?
Well, I actually think this revolution's already completely happened and we're just waiting for the effects, in the sense that whatever social attitudes there have been about a woman's relative role of caregiving, the total number of children born to women has declined dramatically everywhere.
Yeah.
So the facts on the ground are, when fertility was 6 per woman, 7 per woman, 8 per woman, you could at least imagine defining a woman's lifetime role around that caregiving. That revolution's over. Fertility is down to near replacement levels in nearly every country in the world, and hence you can't even, I just think facts on the ground are way ahead in some sort of attitudes, and what we might be seeing are attitudes is pushback against a coming reality. But the reality is you can't imagine defining a woman's role strictly in terms of caregiving if you're only having 2 children. There just isn't that much care to be given to 2 children versus 8 children. So I think there is an inevitable revolution in this coming, and we're going to see its effects soon. So to some extent, the revolution, that set of attitudes has collapsed. The material foundation of that set of attitudes has collapsed, and we're just waiting for the building to crumble.
And maybe pushback was inevitable too.
Yeah, and maybe pushback is inevitable, because oftentimes, after all, we have to acknowledge that oftentimes pushback is not a true reversion, but the last gasp of a dying, a dying ideology. So seeing flare-ups is evidence of almost complete victory rather than some movement being under threat. I don't think anywhere in the world you're going to go back to the fundamental schooling conditions and the fundamental fertility decisions changing in any significant way. And given that those underlying material conditions have changed, once the facts on the grounds have changed, the ideas and heads are going to change eventually.
I wish Mr. Pritchett was right. Unfortunately, he is not. Because, you see, child care is only one part of the care work that women take on. There's care of the elderly. There's care of the handicapped. There is cooking and cleaning. 600 million Africans cannot switch on electricity. It's women who get up in the morning to go to find the firewood, to cook the food, and walk even 10, 15 kilometers to look for that energy, who walk to look for water. So who even walk miles to go to deliver the baby because there's no proper road to get to the clinic to do antenatal and postnatal and whatever. So and this is not just in the poorest countries, agrarian, where there's no infrastructure for energy and water. I'm seeing it now in Europe. Increasingly, I'm seeing young couples asking for their retired mother to come to live near them to take care of the baby so that they can go to work, because somehow these countries are rolling back the welfare state. The aging populations and the burden on their welfare economies is huge, and they're beginning to roll back. So we see, you have a country like Japan. I went to Japan. I visited a women's magazine and asked to meet the directors. I had an appointment. 6 men walked in. They said, we are the directors of this women's magazine. I couldn't understand. I said, what? Why? And they looked and they smiled and they said, you know, our deadlines, we work up to 3 a.m. No woman can do that here in Japan. I mean, clearly you can see that this challenge is not just about having a baby. It's really a deeper challenge. There's a crisis in care globally. I was in Boston. I shed a tear. I found there a woman whom I used to know. She's a Ugandan woman. She used to be the head of the clinical services of the best teaching hospital in the country. She migrated. She's left that top job, training all the doctors on clinical work. She's now wheeling one patient in Boston because Uganda can't pay her a decent wage in the care industry, can't pay her properly. And here, America also won't pay decent pay for carers, and therefore is using illegal migrant labor. There's a crisis in care globally.
Yes. Another question in the front here. The lady in the orange shirt.
Thank you. I'm Mzodo Mabuza, the Tripartite Free Trade Area Coordinator based in Lusaka, Zambia. Thank you, Winnie, for coining this term. It's a rigged economy, it's a rigged political environment, it's a rigged society. Before I joined COMESA, I headed the Chamber of Commerce in Swaziland. I was the second Indian organization that has been in existence in 100 years. So basically, I was the second woman to be in charge. And when I was there, we conducted a study among SMEs. We realized that women were not well represented in the Chamber of Commerce. So I moved to the board to say, can we have a women's chapter, Chamber of Commerce? Fortunately, the board approved. But the resistance that I got from business people to say, why would you bother about women? So the question is, how do we get this, with all the research and evidence out there to show that women are equally capable? How then do we put the message across? Even at COMESA where I am, we have a gender office. Immediately, our colleagues in gender talk about gender mainstreaming. You can see people rolling their eyes, literally. What do women now want? So I think we still have a long way. I mean, countries like Rwanda, they've just done it. And look at where Rwanda is. 60% of the MPs are women. I mean, the evidence is there. Women can do it. So I'm happy we are here at the IMF, some decision makers, women, some are not women. But let's just go there and do it. Thank you.
Does anyone have anything to add to that on what works? What gets the message across? Sahar?
No,
You're in government. You're one of the only representative of a government on the panel.
No, I honestly think that we need to work on more policies that would mainstream gender. I don't see that we're there yet. The fertility rate might be low in some countries, but very high in others, so that's not
When
sufficient.
you raise, do you get the same reaction when you raise policies to benefit women's participation in the labor force? Do you get the rolled eyes?
Yes, it is a challenge. It is a challenge to mainstream gender in anything. It is a challenge.
Your colleagues in the cabinet will look at, there she goes again.
I mean it overall, not necessarily my colleagues in the cabinet. I don't want to get in trouble.
So can I?
But honestly, I have to say, we have a president that supports gender mainstreaming. We have a president that supports women for a fact. He has several women advisors. We're now 4. We have a parliament that has 15. So we're heading in the right direction, but we have a long way to go. So I tend to agree that we can do it, but we need to do more.
Yeah. Laura?
Well, I just want to say that I certainly, one thing that came immediately to mind is that this issue of rolled eyebrows is in every area of life, in every profession. It's still in academia. If you're talking about academic appointments at a research university and you bring up the importance of gender diversity, the first thing people will say to you is, we're excellent. So gender doesn't really matter to us. We're excellent. Okay, so this is pervasive. I do want to start there. I do want to say that thinking about how you mobilize opinion. So we were talking about investors before. So an area where you can mobilize companies to act different if their investors care about it. Their investors say, you know what, I care about this issue. I believe it does affect performance. If your employee base cares about this issue, if you're out there searching for talented, well-educated women in a particular location and they say, I care about having, I will come and work for you or not, depending upon are there women in top management, what's my promotion possibility, they care. Voters, this is the other thing I'm going to say here, because basically if you think about what is going to motivate public officials, it's the voters. It's the voters. So yes, we have a male champion now who's going to transform Canada in very significant ways because the people who elected him partly on this agenda. This is a major agenda for him, and he wants to transform all aspects of Canadian life as possible as he can to be gender neutral. If you introduce, there are some mayors, and there are probably some examples of this in the developing world, I know them in the US, there are some mayors whose electoral base has led them to do things like, I'm looking at transparency in my own city government pay. I'm looking at diversity I'm looking at procurement. I'm doing all of these things from a gender perspective. Why am I doing them? Well, because this is the base that helped elect me. I care about this. So you've got to mobilize the voters, the investors, the international organizations, and I think we've done that now, to actually say, yeah, this really does matter, and we can try to make it happen. So that's what I would say. David?
I think we have to recognize that, as some of the people in the audience have pointed, and as Winnie has pointed out, there are differences in social attitudes, there are different ideologies. It's one thing if the electorate comes around and is supporting change, but there are plenty of countries around the world where that's not happening. I don't think the Taliban is a last gasp of a dying ideology.
Well, I would say, actually, I would put Japan
ISIS.
in that category too. Prime Minister Abe was not elected on a platform of improving
my point
access
is
for
that
women.
we have seen huge changes, disappearances of ideologies or changes in approaches. The most obvious and hugest one was the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the system of governance. It was more a system of governance and sort of bad economics there. I think the best that the IMF can do, just speaking from our standpoint, we're not going to be doctors of social attitude change or of ideological change, but we can show countries the benefits of change. We can try to get some who are willing to embrace it and show that it works, and then see whether others will emulate that. Poland did a bunch of change. Other countries, Belarus, Ukraine, are still thinking about it. In Africa, I mean, it's not, none of these analogies are at all meant to be exact or even that close to the gender set of issues, but we're talking about ideology and social attitude change. There are policies that were considered normal in Africa for decades, having fuel subsidies, for example, where now some governments have realized that fuel subsidies, which the politicians always sold as being good for the poor people, were really good for the rich people because they were conveyed in the form of lower prices. And so if you have 4 cars, you get more subsidy than if you're taking the bus. And now, as governments realize, some governments realize that's wrong, make progress, have benefits, others will emulate. I'm not sure that we as an institution can do more than trying to find experimenters, trying to then drive home the lessons.
One more question we have time for, right here in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Emma Bergether. I'm with the Bretton Woods Project. I have maybe a suggestion for Mr. Lipton on how to push the envelope inside the IMF particularly to help things move along.
Good, I'm looking forward to it.
And understanding that the IMF is new to this and still learning and exploring. So rather than adding in a few recommendations on female labor force participation in your surveillance, which is what the pilot programs on gender have done so far, I think what would be required is a much more critical look at how IMF policies that you regularly recommend. So that's in a surveillance review. That's the paragraphs before and after the paragraph on female labor force participation. You know, how they may negatively impact women's economic empowerment. And so that means really transforming your policies towards more things like progressive tax policies, investment in public expenditures and public services, and growing fiscal space and protecting labor rights. So, you know, it's really about a more transformational approach that really looks at structural macroeconomic barriers. And I think that's what the IMF could do.
No, thank you. Look, if your suggestion, I think your suggestion is consistency, and I think that's an entirely fair point. We may differ on some of the points that you raised, but I think we have been very much attuned to many of the policy areas you talk about. We advocate progressive taxation for obvious reasons that have been pointed out here, and you know, I see it as a huge problem that countries, the one that comes to mind that I've worked on recently, Pakistan collects almost no income tax from the well-to-do in the country. In fact, most of the parliamentarians don't pay any income tax. That's a travesty. We've had that discussion in our discussions with Greece. I think as far as redistributional policies, we define them very broadly. So when we talk about infrastructure, and we've been advocating that countries dedicate more resources to infrastructure. We talk about the range of infrastructure, from social infrastructure, meaning health and education, to physical infrastructure. Even now, such modern things as facilitating cellular telephone communications is a woman's issue in yes. countries in Africa, where that means financial inclusion. It means it can have other benefits. So, look, I think your point is right. The general point is right. We should be consistent and we should be supportive across the board.
David, it's your panel. You get the last word. Lant, Pritchett, Laura Tyson, David Lipton, Minister Nasr, Winnie Byanyima, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. Thank you.